I'd like to welcome everyone to this seminar to mark the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. And I think, as we all know, the consequences of the decisions and actions taken in the lead up to that and around that time have continued to have a very major impact in that country, in the region and in the world. And I think they will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. They had an impact not only directly, obviously, on the people involved, but specifically for our work. And I think perhaps many of the feelings we had at the time and around the time have continued to be borne out in the way that geopolitics essentially has played out. A great deal of investigation and analysis and reflections have been made since that time in the form of official inquiries in the UK and US and elsewhere, analysis and commentary. VERTIC put out a lot of very good material in the lead up to that time, and in fact, since it started putting out material since the early 90s, you can see in amongst many other very relevant articles, which if anyone wants to, they'll go back and they'll see many of the issues popping up now that were talked about in the 90s. Iraq gets a considerable amount of attention in the lead up to the invasion and then around it. Those pieces were written by VERTIC staff, but you'll also see some names of absolutely critical people who were kind enough to write articles and sometimes forewords to those pieces. So I think it shows the seriousness with which this organisation took that issue, and also the perhaps, let's say, the regard that we had for other people involved and they had for what we were trying to do at that time. I wasn't with the organisation just then, but we have three people who I know very well who were, and I'm very pleased to say that I've worked with all of them. So we have Trevor Findlay and Angela Woodward and Oliver Meier here. I joined shortly after, I joined the organisation shortly after, but they were all there in the thick of it. And we're all absolutely delighted, and Grant in particular, whose brainchild this was, to hear their reflections on what happened. I think, as we know, there have been lots of analysis going on about the actual invasion, about the intelligence estimates, about verification. We may talk about that today, but we're also going to talk about how things went in the organisation, for the leadership of the organisation and for people in it, and what they felt and what they're dealing with at the time. I mean, I certainly remember it being a very alarming and confusing time, and it's interesting reading back some of the official investigations that let's say the gut instinct that one had on some issues were borne out to be correct, but there were nuances and subtleties that have only come out in later years. In any case, I'd like to thank Trevor, Angela and Oliver very much for giving us their time, because it's very late for some of you. And I'd like all the participants, I'd like to say thank you to you as well. And I'd like to say, Grant, thanks very much. I'm going to hand over now.
All right. A very smooth technical segue where I just tilt my computer, highly professional and high production values. No, thank you all very much. I'm really pleased to be able to have you, and apologies and thank you to everyone watching. As you can tell, the reason we've scheduled this at 9 AM is because since being at VERTIC, Trevor, Oliver and Angela, well, Angela's still at VERTIC, have scattered to the four corners of the globe. And we have some participants in New Zealand, Australia, and Oliver, you're still in Germany, that's correct? Yeah. So Trevor is a former executive director of VERTIC from 1998 to 2005, and is currently a principal fellow at Melbourne. Angela is our current deputy executive director of VERTIC and also head of one of our programs. And Oliver is the new policy and research director at the European Leadership Network, and he was at VERTIC from 1999 to 2002. And when I thought of this idea of how can we mark the Iraq War I immediately reached out to Trevor and Oliver and Angela, and they immediately agreed to discuss this with the idea of reflecting on the VERTIC experience, but basically the NGO experience of, you know, how did we do? What's our scorecard? What can we think about this? What was it like being involved and trying to inform the public and also policymakers, as was our role. Obviously extremely challenging, and I'll let them be the judge of what they think. Some maybe there were some successes along with the obvious overall policy failure. So we asked them all to reflect. So I'm going to first go to Trevor and ask, you know, what did it feel like to be working on this issue during this time, particularly in VERTIC and the other NGOs working across this sector?
Thanks, Grant, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join this seminar. It's a great initiative, and thank you for setting this up. The thing that struck me most, looking back on our various publications and thinking about how we operated during that time, was the degree of uncertainty. I mean, in retrospect, we know how the story played out, but at the time we didn't. And so we were operating as a very small NGO in a much larger group of London-based NGOs with a focus on verification and monitoring. And so we were really the ones who were expected to come up with technical judgments about whether the official UN inspections were working well, whether the accusations of the United States and the UK about Iraq were credible or not. And it was a difficult space to be working in because we were an open source based organization. We didn't have access to intelligence. So here we were being asked to comment on the use of intelligence information from unknown sources often, and the relation of that intelligence information to the official UN bodies, UNMOVIC, then UNSCOM, then UNMOVIC, and the IAEA, of course, in the nuclear field, and try to make judgments about what we thought was the truth. After all, trust and verify was our masthead, and we were trying to follow that precept that we should trust but also verify. And we were following pretty closely the events in the lead up to the Iraq War through Trust and Verify. I noticed we did pretty comprehensive coverage. We also had the yearbook, the verification yearbook, and we covered that extensively in the yearbook. But my thought now, retrospectively, is that this has no comparison to the way NGOs today can have an impact, which is essentially instantaneous through Twitter and other social media. We spent a lot of time analyzing information and then writing, hopefully, intelligent articles, which then wouldn't appear for maybe a week or so after editing, in the case of the yearbook, a year later. So to have an impact was difficult because the situation was moving rapidly. And in some respect, we didn't even expect there to be an invasion. We were thinking, well, maybe the invasion is meant to cow Iraq into complying better with the inspection regime. And that's one of Hans Blix's thoughts as well, that ultimately sanity would prevail. There were a couple of incidents, though, which enabled me, on behalf of VERTIC, to at least inject some real-time thought into what was happening. And one was the Foreign Office called me in and asked for my opinion on what should happen with Iraq. I thought this was pretty extraordinary for a very small NGO. I think we're only half a dozen people to be called in to the Foreign Office and asked for our opinion. And this was essentially about what to do about the inspection. Should they carry on or should they be wound up? Should we allow more time for the inspections? I gave the VERTIC line, which was that certainly the inspectors had barely scratched the surface and should be allowed more time. Hans Blix was talking about months. El Baradei was talking up to a year at the time for the nuclear inspections. So we were making the case that verification was still significant and there were things to be found and they should be allowed to fulfill their mandate properly. The second thing that happened was the BBC asked me to go on live during Colin Powell's presentation to the UN Security Council apart from anything that was extremely frightening, because anything could have happened. We had no advance warning of what Powell was going to say. And I was there in the BBC studio live and being asked to comment on accusations against Iraq of non-compliance, of which we only just heard that very minute in some cases. So, but this was a huge opportunity for VERTIC to actually get in word very early, in the way now that social media allows, to get in our opinion on the credibility or otherwise of the information being presented at the UN Security Council. Very fortunately, I was super skeptical, because even on the face of it, a lot of it just didn't seem credible. And even at the end, there seemed to be a collective view that really this didn't amount to very much at all. And as we know, Colin Powell retrospectively said it was the worst thing he'd ever had to do in his life. So, but to have VERTIC there at the table and being asked about the credibility of the verification accusations, I think was extremely important. But thinking about it in retrospect, as I say, does make me think that these days we would operate in a very different way because of the instantaneous nature of communications and the ability to reach a much larger audience very quickly in real time.
Thank you, Trevor. Absolutely extraordinary account, really. And I know we've discussed this before, but there were some things there that I didn't know about, like being called into the Foreign Office, and very, very interesting. So Oliver, we know that you were at VERTIC, but you moved during the summer before the invasion. So you had quite a different experience as we moved into kind of the highest tensions before the invasion.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for organizing this. Let me maybe start by saying, you know, this may seem an historical topic, but clearly it's relevant to at least 3 current crises, which involve some degree of WMD allegations or use, and often when you know, you work on issues related to Iran, for example, there is the question of interpretations behind WMD or nuclear programs in this case. You know, what is the purpose of that? Something that came up during the Iraq war. Syria, chemical weapons, no closure, the question of accountability. There's certainly, you know, often one thinks back to discussions on the Iraq war and Ukraine, of course, fake news and the allegations in the context of conventional aggression. So, you know, there are clearly things that are still relevant. Today, as you said, I left VERTIC in the summer of 2002, so a good half year before the war started, moved back to Berlin, and then in the run-up to the war was working as a staffer in the German Bundestag in Parliament, the Subcommittee for Arms Control, Disarmament and Arms Control. So I, you know, the run up to the war, the last months before the invasion started, I was in a different context, but I could use a lot of the research that VERTIC was doing and we had been doing at VERTIC in that context. So that was really quite interesting. For me, we could, for example, bring in some of the inspectors I had met in the context of VERTIC, my work at VERTIC, into the Bundestag, because the member of parliament I was working for, Uta Zapf, was very open to this kind of advice, and that was really interesting to do that. One of the inspectors we were able to bring to Berlin was David Kelly, actually, a key person in this whole saga, particularly in the UK politics, because as some of you may remember, David, who was a great and very impressive person, was involved in many inspections and got into the crossfire, if you like, because he did actually speak to the press about some of the false allegations also put forward by the UK government, and was left out in the cold, basically, and later on took his life. That really, hit home that these are not abstract academic discussions, but that the people we were dealing with were actually in the midst of things. That was really a shock for, I think, all of us who knew David and had worked with him. He had written also a chapter for, at least one chapter for the verification yearbook, and we had been in close contact with him and his colleagues. Like Trevor, it was really interesting that suddenly, with these rather abstract issues around verification, there was a lot of demand from the press. Like Trevor, I was live on German TV for hours commenting on UN Security Council sessions, which was a really bizarre experience at times to be on live for such a long time. But generally speaking, as like Trevor said, because there were no social media that we could use, a lot of work being done through the press, and that was really, really interesting. Like Trevor, in hindsight, it's always easy to speak about these things, but I think we made the right points on verification that, there's no, you cannot close these verification files, that these are open processes, that the inspectors need time to get their work done, that there's never 100% security that certain things are absent, a point that the Bush administration was trying to push here, and but maybe we missed the larger context and didn't really speak out enough about the political intentions of the Bush administration. I think a lot of the discussions about going to war may actually have been made while we were still making technical arguments about verification, but that did help, I think, to at least give arguments for particularly the German government and the French government, which opposed the war. That, I think, in retrospect, was also very helpful because it paved the way for more EU work on these issues. The European Security Strategy, which was agreed half a year later, there was also an EU strategy on WMD non-proliferation, I think all of these initiatives were partly born out of the fact that there were Europeans at the time which did oppose the war. So that was, I think, in hindsight, also a quite important part of the work that civil society had been doing at the time. So let me leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver, for those very thoughtful remarks, and thank you again for bringing up David Kelly. Although I was not in the field at that time, I think it's important to reflect on those matters. And Trevor, I believe that you said that there was an issue or a yearbook dedicated to him.
Yep.
Angela, what are your thoughts about that time?
Thank you, Grant, and thank you for convening this panel. I feel like we've got the VERTIC, it's like a VERTIC family reunion, having my dear colleagues join us. I join you from New Zealand, from the beaches of Christchurch in New Zealand, to share my experiences of the time at VERTIC. And really, the case of Iraq has shaped my entire career. Iraq invaded Kuwait shortly before I started university. I then went on to join VERTIC between the UNSCOM and UNMIVIC initiatives. And then was really instructive to be at the coalface of verification early in my career, to learn from this quite extraordinary case. So really, VERTIC's, I just share my experiences of the time. So, I mean, VERTIC's analyses of UNSCOM and UNMIVIC as test cases for intrusive and comprehensive verification in hostile circumstances were substantial. As Trevor mentioned, we published many articles in Trust and Verify. We published many yearbook chapters, and we actually developed a UNMIVIC inspection database. We were preparing daily summaries based on Hans Blitz's daily, reports to the Security Council and so on. It was quite a good resource. Sadly, now lost in the mists of time and the electronic archives somewhere. But really, VERTIC's analysis highlighted the political and technical challenges of verification in the Iraq case, but also provided an opportunity to study verification principles in practice. And I think we created a lasting legacy of critical thinking about verification principles from people at the coalface of verification that are still very valid today. Our senior staff at the time, as well as the leaders of the verification activities in Iraq and other Iraq verification analysts, were invited to share their perspectives through our publications series. We had Richard Butler, Hans Blix, Mohammed Al-Baradei writing for Trust and Verify. And in fact, if I may say so, Mohammed Al-Baradei, in his preface to our 2001 yearbook, said that non-governmental actors such as VERTIC have played and will continue to play a significant role in the field of verification research and training, as well as in disseminating information about the importance of verification in arms control and other agreements. And we're certainly endeavouring to continue that today. And of course, Trevor, our director, said in yearbook 2002 that our yearbook series was another modest means of keeping the verification flame alight. And I think that's really quite meaningful. And thankfully, those resources are still all available on our website, and they're still very relevant in discussions about where to take verification forward today. But VERTIC at the time and these publication series, they also created opportunities for training emerging researchers such as myself 20 years ago, as well as interns to train in verification theory and practice in an impartial, policy-focused, non-governmental organisation during one of the most challenging verification initiatives in modern history. VERTIC prides itself on being a training organisation, not just through the provision of impartial research and analysis on verification for the international community, but also training of emerging researchers and future verification practitioners, either taken on as staff or as paid interns. And in fact, many of our staff and former interns have gone on to have careers in the arms control field, including at the UK MOD and Foreign Office, the US National Nuclear Security Administration. One became a Minister of State in the Irish government and have even gone on to head their own policy think tanks, working on nuclear safeguards, nuclear security, nuclear disarmament. So they took that grounding in verification practice from their time at VERTIC into their future careers, which brings me to the perennial problem for effective verification, being securing adequate funding. Now, VERTIC was only able to carry out all of this research and, be called up to speak at the BBC and called into the Foreign Office because of the funding from major philanthropic foundations that we had at the time in the arms control field. At that time, we had funding from Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust in the UK, as well as the Ford Foundation, the W. Oaten Jones Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and the Ploughshares Fund in the US that funded the yearbook and Trust and Verify, and all of this creative thinking about verification principles, verification theory, verification practice. But from 2004 onward, coinciding with the Bush administration there, those foundations pulled away from funding this type of core analysis. And of those funders, only the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust continues to fund our work, our core functions, including Trust and Verify, for which we remain eternally grateful. We've had to become very resourceful in securing a mix of project grants from predominantly governments, as well as the European Union, both to keep the organisation afloat and to continue our research and training functions. So while core funding remains elusive and project grants have been our reality for nearly 20 years now, funders could helpfully reflect on the benefits of enabling creative thinking on verification, such as we demonstrated during the Iraq case, and reflect on the benefits of training new verification experts in an impartial research and policy organisation such as ours which has provided many trained staff for government administrations and other civil society organisations. Just my personal reflections on the Iraq inspections. I learned a lot about verification theory and practice from UNMIVIC. I was very fortunate to participate in an UNMIVIC training exercise held in the United Kingdom, where new inspectors were practicing observation techniques in a science museum overflow facility, storage facility, in an old World War II aircraft hangar in the British countryside. They were taking their time going through the facility, logging, what they found. Meanwhile, my handlers were explaining to me that in the real case, there'd be armed guards outside because people would be firing guns trying to get in. It remains one of the absolute highlights of my long VERTIC career. Thank you, Grant.
Thank you, Angela. I think that's a very interesting point about, to kind of be able to devote time to all the societal public informing part. You need like you need to be able to make sure that you're not pulling time away from the stuff that people pay you to do, right, as a think tank. So here is, I think, an evergreen question, as evergreen as how much verification is enough. So VERTIC still is an organization focused on making technical analysis and technical points. In the light of how the arguments for Iraq were made and how they were debated in the public space, what effectiveness do you see in retrospect for the kind of technical arguments that VERTIC was making and other NGOs at the time? I think, Trevor, are you interested in taking that one?
Yes, I think, well, I don't think it just applies to verification, but it applies to the relationship between verification and intelligence information. I think one of the lessons that came from Iraq was just how closely intertwined these two activities are and have increasingly become. Prior to that, it seemed verification was really about verification organizations themselves collecting material, then analyzing it, and board of governors or some governing body then deciding whether there was non-compliance or not. But increasingly, the Iraq case demonstrated that you needed intelligence information because the multilateral organizations themselves couldn't collect it. And apart from satellite imagery, wouldn't be able to do so even in the near future. So you had this whole question then of how does an international organization handle national intelligence information that states give it? And I think that's become increasingly important as an issue. We see it in the case of Iran and the IAEA, of course. And the intelligence agencies themselves have responded to what I think is widely now seen as the debacle of Iraq by being much more careful in the way they characterize their findings. So for instance, now US intelligence agencies always say we have good confidence that this information is credible, or moderate confidence. That's all new. We never used to hear that before. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that the intelligence agencies' information and analysis were misused. I don't think they were necessarily wrong themselves, but the politicians were able to manipulate it both in the UK and in the United States to their own ends. So if there's one good thing that's come about this, I think, is the much greater appreciation of the link between intelligence information and verification. So we can ask the question, is verification enough? But you can also ask, is intelligence enough? And is the mix between the two proper and right? And can the multilateral organizations, in this case, make a proper verification determination using not just their own information that they collect, but also very sagely using, well, obviously, all the caveats necessary, information that comes from member states and indeed from civil society through open sources. So the Iraq case really opened up this whole new plethora of information, if you like. And don't even get me started on fake news, because that's a whole nother informational challenge. But it seems to me, before Iraq, we almost seemed naive as the way, according to the way we thought about information and its uses. Now I think we're much wiser in that respect.
Thank you. Does anyone want to come back on that or build on that? Oliver?
No, maybe just to, pick up on what Trevor said towards the end, also the importance of civil society monitoring and involvement here. We already spoke a little bit about providing information via the press, for example, or directly in exchanges with officials, assessments. That was very important. But there was the broader question of what contribution open source information provided by civil society actors, NGOs, can play also in treaty-based verification. And VERTIC itself, as you know, one of the highlights, I guess, in the early years was the monitoring of a Chinese test in 1992 from afar under Patricia Lewis's directorship. I think that threw VERTIC in the limelight early on. It was very important. But when I was at VERTIC, I wrote a chapter, for example, for the VERTIC yearbook with Claire Tenner at the time, who was heading the environment program on civil society monitoring, comparing how open sources are used by civil society actors in environmental agreements, comparing that to the world of arms control. And that was really fantastic because, as far as I recall, we didn't really have a project on that, but there was space and time to actually do that and exploit that. And that, these kind of analysis was very important, I think, in setting the stage. And it's coming back now also because NGOs now have much greater technical capabilities, and there's much more better capabilities and projects to actually bring in this information. But some of the political problems we identified remain, as Trevor has said. What's the interface between international organizations, at the time UNMOVIC, and civil society actors? Is there a way to structure such information to make it more credible? Those issues are still around. And so, I think it was very, very interesting at the time, at the early stages. Also, technically, commercial satellite imagery was just becoming available at a scale and for prices that made it possible for civil society actors to actually use it. To be at VERTIC at that time and use that also in the context of the debate around the WMD allegations against Iraq. So in retrospect, I think that was a really, really interesting experience also. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I think you've largely addressed this question, Oliver, but I've been just completely fascinated by this question since I joined. So I started my work in this field doing open sources and working with satellite imagery and other technical information to try and look at the nuclear programs of states. And the question hangs over me, if we had the capabilities we have today to do the kind of open source work and the satellite imagery available, could have NGOs had a higher impact? Would we have been able to critique better the conclusions being put forward by states, or were there just difficulties in credibly processing a state analysis fast enough in order to be relevant, or were we just going to have difficulty in a media environment where you kind of the state has a lot of avenues to be able to broadcast its assessments and information? Sorry, I made that question quite tough, but if anyone wants to take it.
Just very briefly, I think, the problem in Iraq was that there was no program. So, it's very difficult to use open source information to disprove, to clear up something that isn't there. Therefore, I think, you know, the usefulness probably would have been limited, but otherwise, I think you're right, you know, in terms of ongoing programs, and we see that in the context of chemical weapons use in Syria, for example, and the value that open source information and the analysis that NGOs are providing is immense, also in terms of, you know, making sure that there may be some degree of accountability later on. A lot of that work is being done by civil society actors. So, but I think, you know, in hindsight, I think, I don't know whether the others agree, but I think for the discussion around Iraq, because basically, and, you know, we didn't fully see that at the time, I think this was a political discussion. It wasn't really about the technical capabilities, and we may not have fully grasped that really UNMOVIC was on a mission impossible, given the ideological disposition of the Bush administration at the time, and rightly so. You know, we try to make the case that these inspectors should be given a chance, and what else could you have said? But in hindsight, this is, I don't think, you know, the best open source information would have made much of a difference.
That's incredibly pessimistic, but I think well argued, and I think that really perhaps, you know, that limits us going forward if we're put in the same position and we kind of have to refight the last war, so to speak. You know, we're trying to make some of the same arguments based on technical verification. It sounds like we're going to be in a similar position, despite having incredibly improved capabilities and things that were just only available to the state, you know, now can be done by civil society and NGOs, as was true back then. So we have one question from the audience. Trevor, I wondered if you wanted to comment on any of these things, and then we'll take the question, and as we're at our 20 to 10 UK time limit, we will thank everybody and close the webinar. But Trevor.
Sorry, so what question do you want me to address?
Sorry, do you want to comment on what I was just saying, or
oh yeah, sorry, yes.
Any final remarks?
I think that was probably a bit too pessimistic of you. I mean, there have been some quite striking NGO attempts to monitor North Korea, for instance, especially given the availability of excellent satellite data. So I think the US NGOs which focus on North Korea have really been able to put a spotlight on activities which otherwise would have been withheld from us. So I think that is an example of where continuing developments in technology can help the NGO sector. Also, in the case of Iran, I mean, there's much more information now available through non-governmental organizations about Iran. The Good ISIS in Washington, I probably shouldn't be giving a plug to other NGOs, but they've shown exactly what's possible in having scientific expertise examine official reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency, along with data collected from elsewhere. So I think there is a very bright future for non-governmental organizations, particularly as governments are often reluctant to make public pronouncements about such things. The NGO community can really open the curtain on them. And also with increasing computer power, available to NGOs, not just governments, I think analysis from the digital world can also be incredibly important. So I think there's been an empowerment of NGOs. One difficulty, though, is the crowded field, that there's a lot of NGOs out there, some not necessarily with good intent. So this, to me, is also a new element, that you can have state-based NGOs which are competing with those which have a more liberal outlook based in democracies. So I guess all up, it's a continuing verification and informational struggle, but I don't necessarily think that non-governmental organizations have been put at a huge disadvantage. And if they're creative and continue Angela, you're on board with this, get funding for their activities, then I think there's a huge role to play. I would just note, for instance, increasing official recognition by the International Atomic Energy Agency of NGOs. They're actually negotiating agreements, including with VERTIC, to enable them to collaborate much better with NGOs in the past. So that is also something I think that needs to be pursued more in the future.
Thank you, Trevor. And I think that probably is about as optimistic we're going to get, whilst also being realistic and qualified. So yeah, thank you very much for that answer. I said that we would close at 22. It's now a few minutes past that time. So I'd just like to thank all speakers and participants for just very thoughtful comments. I know that, you know, we're talking about things that everyone here did, but I know Trevor, Oliver, and Angela also, you know, went through all the archival records and maybe, you know, came up with things that they wouldn't necessarily have thought they would said or think, just by thinking over this from this particular perspective. So that's really appreciated. And you know, we have this now. This recording is a resource that can be looked again in future for the 30th and 40th anniversaries, etc. Of such a seminal and important moment in arms control and verification. So thank you very much. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Angela. And thank you, Larry, for opening remarks. And thank you all. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And thank you.
Thank you.